The arrival of a new book by Gary Hamel is always worth paying attention to. Gary Hamel is an author that the Wall Street Journal calls the best business book author and thinker of the moment. So Gary Hamel is absolutely the author. And I have presented in prior years of the First Friday Book Synopsis his books, The Future of Management and What Matters Now. And he has a section in What Matters Now that he has tweaked in this book that is absolutely one of the best things I have ever read, and I will get to that a little bit later. If you will turn to page 2 of the handout, let me begin with what is the point? It's on the left side of the page below the book image. What is the point? Anything that takes away the true, full contribution of people is stifling and harmful. Bureaucracy can do that, and thus it can be, and frequently is, deadly. We need to get rid of bureaucracy and come up with humanocracy. To my knowledge, he coined the word. And so this book is a book against bureaucracy. It's not against government bureaucracy, although it is. It's against bureaucracy in organizations and companies. And I'm going to, in a few moments, define bureaucracy, but bureaucracy in a simple term is it is layer after layer after layer after layer between the worker and the top level, and the top level makes it difficult for the lower level to contribute, to own, to innovate. He says, and he has a great co-author named Michaela Zanini, and they both say together that bureaucracy has harmed productivity, has kept us from advancing and innovating, and is therefore a major problem. On the right, why is this book worth our time? Number one, this book is a terrific overview of the organizational shifts over the last many decades. You will learn some needed history about the organizational structure over the last many decades. Number two, this book is filled with examples of success and failure. You will see their argument through the examples. But at this point, I want to pause. For every example of a company that kind of got rid of bureaucracy or lessened bureaucracy, the fact is that established companies with established bureaucracy have great difficulty making the shift. It is better in newer endeavors. When you have a newer endeavor, it is easier to start with less bureaucracy. Although some of the companies with bureaucracy that is crippling are companies that we sort of think are still relatively new. There are problems, for example, at Microsoft with bureaucracy. So that was kind of interesting. It's really new that has the best shot at doing better. And number three, this book provides a survey of the literature, but is written for the lay practitioner, for the non-academic. You will understand the progression of organizational structure and kind of the regression of organizational structure, and grasp why we are where we are now. Now, you've got a little white space right here, and so let me encourage you to write something down. What will you do with that new hire? And then you could add to that, or with your colleague and team member. How do you create an organization where the people who work there feel like they can genuinely contribute and innovate and own their success? That's what this book is really all about. By the way, Vern Harnish, who wrote Mastering the Rockefeller Habits and Scaling Up, calls this one of the most important books of the year. It was just published in August, and it is, in my opinion, one of the most significant books on organizational structure and development that I've read in quite some time. All right, I'm going to read you just a few of the highlights, not many, but a few. Number one, how would you feel at work if you had the right to design your own job? You were encouraged to grow your skills and take on new challenges. You never felt encumbered by pointless rules and red tape. You felt trusted in every situation to use your best judgment. You were accountable to your colleagues. Your influence and compensation depended on your abilities and not on your rank. Circle that last one. Your abilities and not your rank. This is a book that argues in favor of actual and legitimate meritocracy. Number two, bureaucratic organizations are inertial, incremental, and dispiriting. Boy, that's bad. Inertial, incremental, and dispiriting. In a bureaucracy, the power to initiate change is vested in a few senior leaders. When those at the top fall prey to denial or arrogance or nostalgia, as they often do, the organization falters. That's why deep change in a bureaucracy is usually belated and convulsive. Bureaucracies are also innovation phobic. So not a very flattering paragraph about bureaucracies. And number three, worst of all, bureaucracies are soul crushing. Turn to page 3. Number 17, while there may be a finite number of routine jobs to be performed in the world, there's no limit on the number of worthwhile problems that are begging to be solved. Viewed from this vantage point, the threat that automation poses for employment depends mostly on whether or not we continue to treat employees like robots. In the book, he says, if you give an employee a job and basically do not allow them to use their brain and their initiative and their creativity and their innovative impulses, then you are treating them like a robot, and they will not be able to give you their best. And then before you know it, they won't even give you their medium. And so that's the crushing, the soul crushing elements of the bureaucracy. Number 19, we are defined by the causes we serve. At some deep level, we know that life is too short to work on inconsequential problems. Boy, is that true. All right, I'm going to do a little skipping around. Go to page 4. One quote on page 4, and I hope that Jim Young is on this call because this is Jim Young's mantra. Number 28, in this maelstrom, the most important question for any organization is this: are we changing as fast as the world around us? For most organizations, the answer is no. Absolutely. Look at the bottom of page 4, number 39. In 2007, Steve Ballmer declared that there's no chance the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. No chance. While it's easy to blame Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer for Microsoft's missteps, it's off target. The real culprit was bureaucracy. So that's a pretty bad prediction from Ballmer. All right, turn to page 5. And again, I hope you'll read these not now, but after the presentation later, the ones that I skipped. There are many that are great. Number 53. We have an obligation to pay it forward. We all do. A living wage, equal pay, respect for diversity, parental leave, flex time, health care coverage. These are worth fighting for, but should we aim even higher? We believe so. We think so. I like that quote. All right. Turn to page 7. And there is a couple that I want to read here. Again, I wish we could read them all. Look at number 76. As Thomas Kuhn, the author of the very famous The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he coined the word paradigm. As Thomas Kuhn argued more than a half-century ago, we are prisoners of our paradigms. As Thomas Kuhn observed, all significant breakthroughs are break with old ways of thinking. Thomas Kuhn, in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, said that paradigm shifts frequently come from outsiders. And what he means by that is that you've got a problem, you're looking at it, you're studying it, you become tunnel vision, you can't see possible additional alternatives, and somebody comes in from a different discipline and looks at a problem with different eyes. And because of that, they make a different leap. They break with the normal thinking. And that makes an enormous difference. And I think that's really right. Now look at number 79. And I read this, and then I reread it, and then I realized that's the brilliance, and I had not grasped it. When it set up its Prime subscription service, which offers unlimited 2-day delivery on all orders, Amazon relieved its customers of the need to think about shipping costs each time they placed an order. And I read that to my wife, and she said, that is exactly right. She said, when I buy something from someplace other than Amazon, I'm always agonizing on free shipping. Do I add another item? Do I have to do this? Do I want to pay for this shipping or that? And she says, with Amazon, we are Prime members. We just click the button. It takes away a decision that is draining. That was an innovation that was absolutely brilliant. And then turn to page 8. I'll read the last excerpt. Actually, 2 more. Look at number 86. Progress in addressing sexual abuse, enforcing fiscal responsibility, simplifying central structures has been slow to non-existent in the Catholic Church. Changing the church, Pope Francis remarked in 2018, is like cleaning the Sphinx with a toothbrush. Even infallibility, it seems, bows before bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is hard to overcome. And number 87, we can do better than this, and we must. By embracing the principles and practices of humanocracy, we can build organizations that are as resilient, creative, and passion-filled as the people who work within them. Most importantly, it will turn every job into a good job. Circle that phrase. Turn every job into a good job. Freeing the human spirit. That's the promise of humanocracy, and with grit and determination, you can claim that promise for yourself, your team, and your organization. So those were the key excerpts from the book. Now turn to page 9, and on the left, usually this is a pretty short statement. I kept finding statements that I felt like captured the essence and the thesis of this book. The first one is not from the book, and all the rest are. Bureaucracy, noun, a system of administration marked by officialism, red tape, and proliferation. So that's what a bureaucracy is. All right, these are all from the book. Our starting premise Across the world, organizations are disabled by bureaucracy. They are inertial, incremental, and inhuman. The premise of this book is that most of these choices can and must be revisited. These companies were built, or in some cases rebuilt, with one goal in mind: to maximize human contribution. Circle that phrase: to maximize human contribution. The goal of Humanocracy is to create an environment in which everyone is inspired to give their best. One of our primary goals in this book is to lay out a blueprint for turning every job into a good job. Rather than de-skilling work, we need to upskill employees. I don't think I wrote this clearly in the other part of the handout, so let me say it here now. What they say in this book is that when you hire a person, you need to make sure that they can make all of their contributions they could possibly make. And one of the things you need to do is to provide some skill upgrade so that they are more capable of making their contributions. And so that's really important about upskilling employees. As we've argued throughout this book, the shift to humanocracy requires radical change in individuals and teams and the core processes by which our organizations are run. Bureaucracy was invented by human beings, and now it's up to us to invent something better. The question at the core of bureaucracy is, how do we get human beings to better serve the organization? The question at the heart of Humanocracy is, what sort of organization elicits and merits the best that human beings can give? And last, the goal of Humanocracy is to create an environment in which everyone is inspired to give their best. Now, I've already told you a little bit about Gary Hamel, and they work together in something called the Management Lab that Gary Hamel, I think, created. He's co-founder. Here are a few stories. This one's, I want you to ponder this for a minute. Have you ever tried to make a change in your own time management, your own clutter control, your own weight management? Have you ever tried to make a change and 6 months later, a year later, you went back to where you were? Well, organizations do that. And in the book, they refer to sensitivity training in the 1960s. Tens of thousands of managers from IBM and General Electric and Monsanto were sent off for sensitivity training. Managers were challenged to become more authentic and human-centered leaders. I would be tempted to pause at this point and just ask, what do you learn from the news about how many organizations have had really bad managers and leaders who are not very authentic and human-centered? Well, many participants found the experience to be transformative, but in most cases, the metamorphosis was short-lived. As Art Kleiner describes it in The Age of Heretics, bullying managers who had learned to listen open-heartedly began bullying again. In other words, while T-group training, that's the sensitivity training, built self-awareness, it didn't equip managers for the gritty work of retooling bureaucratic structures and systems. What they say in the book is that sensitivity training worked short-term, but the bureaucracy crushed the changes. And therefore, they reverted back to bullying, not listening, not freeing up employees' management. In the book, there are stories of success. Nucor, Haier, these are international companies, Toyota, and Southwest Airlines. Look at this first excerpt here. You'll recall that Haier, this is a company that makes appliances, among other things, shed 10,000 middle management jobs when it moved to its micro enterprise model, a shift that enhanced rather than impaired its organizational effectiveness. Haier developed a community laundry app solution so that people who live in dormitories, people who live in apartment buildings, they don't own their own washing machines and dryers. They use the laundry that is available to all. They created an app where they can put their money in the app, punch the button, and the washing machine starts. A real innovation. Herb Kelleher said that, quote, "We give people the opportunity to be a maverick." Turn to page 10. In a book, in a bank called Handelsbanken in Europe, it regards every branch as a standalone business, no top-down mandates. Here's what they say. In Nucor and Haier and Handelsbanken, all of those created ways for teams at what we would call a lower level to have their own independence. They set budgets, they bought things, they didn't have to go through purchasing, they didn't have to go through bureaucracy, they could make their own changes. They were micro enterprises. Each bank branch was its own company in terms of organizational freedom. And what it says is you've got to let people be in touch with customers, make their own innovations, and then make the progress. It is not bureaucracy, but humanocracy. They talk about Gillette, that because they did not adapt, they were nearly put under by, what is it called, Dollar Shave Club, and is it Harry's Razors? I use Dollar Shave Club. Their market share shrank from 71% to 59% because they did not work through, get rid of the bureaucracy that brought about the possibility of innovation. And Ray Dalio of Bridgewater, in his book Principles, great book, I have presented that and my synopsis available on the website. Dalio writes that the company operates as an idea meritocracy, not an autocracy in which I lead and others follow, and not a democracy in which everyone's vote is equal, but a meritocracy that encourages thoughtful disagreements and explores and weighs people's opinions in proportion to their merits. It's hard to argue with Dalio's point that power should lie in the reasoning, not the position of the individual. And they use a dot ranking approach throughout at that company, and that is described in my synopsis of Principles. But the dots that are given to people all the time literally create who gets what promotion, who gets this, who gets that, and it's very equal. All right, everybody take your pen and put a box around this little section, the hierarchy of work-related capabilities. This is in What Matters Now, and he tweaked it, and it's brilliant. I think it is absolutely brilliant. You start at the bottom. You hire somebody new, level one, you want them to be obedient. You tell them what to do, you want them to do it. Level two, you want them to build diligence, and then they move up to level three, you want them to develop and have expertise. And then I draw a line there because it's a shift after that. Now they begin being more self-directed. And so level four is initiative. They begin to take initiative. And number five, they develop creativity and they come up with their own solutions and they are innovative and they're given the freedom to be that. And then level 6, this is the tweak. In what matters now, he called that passion. But now he labels it daring. That they can become daring because they have developed the expertise and now they're innovative. So this is not ignorant innovation. This is informed innovation that leads to confidence, self-confidence, and daring. We really should remember that it hasn't worked. Leadership training hasn't worked very well, hardly at all. Sensitivity training disappeared in terms of the pros of it, in terms of the advantages that it brought. It just didn't last. There are too many big success stories that have not lasted. Take away yesterday's stock market roller coaster, and if you're not aware of this, 2 days ago, get ready for this, the company that was the most valuable company just a few years ago was Exxon. 2 days ago, Apple was worth 120 something billion more than Exxon, plus another 2 trillion. So it was breathtaking. And the reality is that yesterday's successes, many of them have not done well. General Electric, Exxon, and some others compared to the rest of what's happening. All right? So among the many reasons, power is the ability to afford not to learn. The ability to afford not to learn. The single greatest threat to organizational resilience, the unwillingness or inability of senior leaders to write off their own depreciating intellectual capital. An organization's capacity for renewal should never depend on the capacity of a few senior leaders to learn and unlearn, but in a bureaucracy, it often does. All right, I've got to move very quickly. Most people still work in big organizations. Let's assume that bureaucracy works great until it doesn't. And you need humanocracy, not bureaucracy, for innovation, ownership, mission with passion. This book is really the wisdom of crowds on steroids. That's my line. The bureaucracy won't like changing. They will not want to give up power, not ever. So the humanocracy genome, we've got to build organizations that are as capable as the people within them. We need to start over. We need a new organizational paradigm in which human beings are no longer viewed as resources or capital. The goal is to maximize contribution, not compliance. Together, they form the humanocracy genome. The humanocracy formula, because each human being is valued in every way, the essential distinction is human beings are instruments employed by an organization to create products and services. That's bureaucracy. In a humanocracy, the organization is the instrument. It's the vehicle human beings use to better their lives and the lives of those they serve. So remove a lot of layers. Turn to page 11. This is big. Don't treat any worker as low-skilled permanently. Don't view any job as a low-skilled job. In the chapter on chapter 4, New Core, I think it is, they describe how lower-level employees redesign massively expensive pieces of machinery based on their use, and the top wants them to do that. So that's really interesting. The 7 core tenets of humanocracy, you want to read these. In a humanocracy, my work is my passion. I get to make meaningful business decisions. I feel directly accountable to customers. I intuitively think lean. My team is small and super flexible. The success of this business depends critically on me. I measure progress in days and weeks, not months and quarters. Every day, I have the chance to solve new, interesting problems. I have a significant financial stake in the success of this business. Drop down a little, think and act like a hacker. Become a hacktivist. Could rebel hackers have the same dramatic impact on management they've had on software? Yep. To be a hacker, you have to get a basic thrill from solving problems, sharpening your skills, and exercising your intelligence. Take your pen and put a box around this next section, just the end of the page nearly. A thought for those of us who work by ourselves, me, or in very small companies. You've established, whether you realize it or not, your own little fiefdom of bureaucracy, whether you know it or not. You may be your own bureaucratic nightmare. Here's why. Innovation comes from many, many ideas. These ideas have to do with problems to solve. So instead of just working like you always do, schedule your own humanocracy schedule into each week with time and ritual and designed activity for problem identification and idea generation. Turn to page 12 at the bottom of the page. 7 lessons and takeaways. Number 1, the future belongs to those with the best next ideas. You need a lot of ideas from anyone and everyone to find the best ideas. Number 2, in order to find the best ideas, everyone has to be free of bureaucracy that stifles ideas. Number 3, in order for people to come up with such ideas, they have to be valued as human beings and set free. Set free to think, to ponder, to try, and fail, and to make some money in the process. Number 4, you need to both exploit what is working and explore what will work next. Explore and then exploit, and keep exploring. So circle that and ponder the exploit and explore contrast. Number 5, start with yourself. Do some soul repair in the areas where bureaucracy has eaten away at our humanity. Number 6, basically put the wisdom of crowds to work. Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And number 7, reluctantly a warning. It may be that starting from scratch is better. Maybe building a humanocracy is what you have to do from scratch. Humanocracy does not come easily. And number 7, you do get what you design, or rather at the end, you do get what you design. Humanocracy, creating organizations as amazing as the people inside them. Hope you found this useful. I'm going to take 45 seconds to drink water. Put anything in the chat that you gained from this book, and I'll be back in 45 seconds. I'm back on. Please take in your hands the handout, The Color of Law. I'm going to share the screen for a moment. I want to show you something that is really, really quite disturbing. This is Shingle Mountain. I've got 2 pictures of it, this one and this one. Yes, it is exactly what it sounds like. It is a mountain of shingles. This is practically in the backyard of a woman in South Dallas. I want you to look at it. I want you to think about what shingles are made of. Imagine breathing the air around this mountain of shingles as wind stirs up the shingle debris. I want you to imagine what it's like for that entire neighborhood forget the fact that it is ugly looking, it is dangerous breathing. Shingle Mountain is there right now. If you Google it later on your own, you'll find out about how long they have tried to get rid of Shingle Mountain. Shingle Mountain is in a neighborhood of citizens, residents of Dallas. The company that put it all there was ordered by the courts last year, one solid year ago, to get rid of it. It's still there. The city can't really afford to take care of it. So it's sitting there. Now, for those of you who don't live in the Dallas area, you may not get this illustration, but I want you to ask yourself this question if you know Dallas, and you can pick your own neighborhood from where you live. Can you imagine that mountain being built of shingles in Highland Park, in University Park, in the better neighborhoods of Frisco or North Dallas? If it did happen to show up, I can promise you it would be gone immediately. The wealthy neighborhoods have influence and resources that the poor, predominantly Black neighborhoods do not have. That is reality. And so when you think about the color of law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America, we're talking about a significant difference between what wealthy people experience and what minority, very much African American, and poorer areas experience. Well, this book, this is my third book in a series of 4 that I am doing at First Friday Book Synopsis. I've had people recommend some other books to do, but I had kind of committed that I would only do 4 months. I'm going to ponder some other way to do other books, but I am going to go back to 2 business books a month in November. So we've got this month and 1 more month for the 4 books. This book is quite academic. The first 2 books I did, Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, was about the history. It was about the viewpoint that not only the Southern Confederacy had, but really all of America had, about how African Americans, Black people, were less than white people. They were not full citizens. They were not fully human. That book chronicled that and really did prove it in terms of that was the viewpoint. There was no doubt about it. And then last month, I did White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And that book was about how white people kind of absolutely reject the accusations that they are racist. And that book said, and this book says, that systemic racism is real, and it may not be conscious, but it is absolutely real. And the parallel that I could not escape in my own thinking was, let me remind you that the Holocaust occurred with the acquiescent silence of both the Protestant churches and the Catholic Church in Germany. People who were good Christians, who went to church and loved their God, turned a blind eye to the legal maneuverings, legal in the sense that they were laws of Germany at the time, in the legal maneuverings to shut aside Jewish people and ultimately to kill them. Well, let me tell you that church-going people, this is not in dispute, church-going people in the United States, especially in the South, but not just in the South. Church-going people turned a blind eye to the segregation in terms of the harm that that brought to human beings. And this book, The Color of Law, is a book about the laws that made all of that possible. And I want you to remember Shingle Mountain in Dallas in 2020, where there is an entire neighborhood that will live fewer years. This is not in dispute because of the air they're breathing, the debris of those shingles. All right, on page 2, what is the point? Segregation, keeping Black people apart from white people, was baked into the law of the land, keeping African Americans out of neighborhoods, work, schools, and opportunities. It is the color of the laws we established. Now, this is partly an academic book, but what it is describing created kind of the background and kind of the ripple effects that lead to poorer Black neighborhoods and therefore fewer opportunities to go to college and to build a life that could escape that, because they're in an environment where it is everybody under the power structure. At the top of the page, why is this book worth our time? Segregation is real, lasting, and intentional. De jure segregation, not de facto, but de jure, by law and public policy. Yes, I had to look it up. I'm not a lawyer. Number 2, this segregation was nationwide in scope and multi-decade in duration. And number 3, and the effects of this perpetual creation of maintaining of segregation are ongoing and sadly will be ongoing. Let me just give one item from the news this week. Nick Saban, the head coach of the University of Alabama football team, led the entire team on a march across the Alabama campus in support of social justice for African Americans. Nick Saban, who is white, led that march. Somebody who writes sports in Alabama said that Nick Saban is arguably the most influential person in Alabama. Well, let me remind you that in June of 1963, Governor George Wallace stood at the door of the University of Alabama and did not let 2 African-American students in. They got in through the back door. It was a photo op. He had already lost the battle. But in 1963, when I was in junior high school, the University of Alabama would not allow a single Black student in until that year. And so Nick Saban doing that shows that there's been a shift, but the ripple effects continue. All right, very quickly, I'll read a number of these highlighted passages. Number 1, banks discriminated with redlining, refusing to give mortgages to African Americans or extracting unusually severe terms from them with subprime loans. This went on through the 60s. The Civil Rights Law and the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65 made a dent, but the housing laws did not make enough of a dent. It became illegal, but not necessarily not practiced for quite some time. And if you're not aware of this, even if a Black person made enough money, because they were African American, the government would not back the loans, and the mortgage companies would not make the loans, and this was what redlining was. Number 2, until the last quarter of the 20th century, racially explicit policies of federal, state, and local governments defined where whites and African Americans should live. Number 3, the de facto segregation myth has now been adopted by conventional opinion, liberal and conservative alike. De facto, it was just the private practice. Today's residential segregation in the North, South, Midwest, and West is not the unintended consequence of individual choices and of otherwise well-meaning law or regulation, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area in the United States. The policy was so systematic and forceful that its effects endure to the present time. Number 5, in 1866, admittedly a long time ago, Congress enforced the abolition of slavery by passing a Civil Rights Act, 1866, prohibiting actions that it deemed perpetuated the characteristics of slavery. Actions that made African Americans second-class citizens, such as racial discrimination in housing, were included in the ban. It did not agree that exclusions from housing markets could be a badge or incident of slavery. In consequence, these Civil Rights Act protections were ignored for the next century, so to most of us, it should now seem reasonable to agree that Congress was correct when it determined that prohibiting African Americans from buying or renting decent housing perpetuated second-class citizenship that was a relic of slavery. Number 8, let bygones be bygones is not a legitimate approach if we wish to call ourselves a constitutional democracy. Number 14, put a star beside 14. The core argument of this book is that African Americans were unconstitutionally denied the means and the right to integration in middle-class neighborhoods. And because this denial was state-sponsored, the nation is obligated to remedy it. You might wonder at this point, the author of this book, Richard Rothstein, is white. He is a professor. He has studied this extensively. This was a much talked about book when it came out, and it is still a bestseller because it chronicles the problem. Number 19, Richmond, California had been overwhelmingly white before the war. The federal government's decision to segregate public housing established segregated living patterns that persist to this day. And if you don't remember from an earlier presentation, the GI Bill, which gave government-backed loans to veterans after the war, excluded African American veterans in the early years. And so it was an uneven playing field that kept it unfair to African Americans. Turn to page 4, look at number 21. The city's police stopped African American men on the street and then arrested and jailed them if they couldn't prove they were employed. They were arrested for vagrancy because they were not employed, but they could not get the jobs and they did not have the education. And so vagrancy was frequently used, in essence, to punish the failures of people that had little chance to succeed. Number 26, at the time, Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration not only refused to insure mortgages for African Americans in designated white neighborhoods, they would also not insure mortgages for whites in a neighborhood where African Americans were present. So they kept the races separate. In ways like these, federal, state, and local governments purposely created segregation in every metropolitan area of the nation. Turn to page 5, number 40. We like to think of American history as a continuous march of progress toward greater freedom, greater equality, and greater justice. You know, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But sometimes we move backward, dramatically so. Residential integration declined steadily from 1880 to the mid-20th century, and it has mostly stalled since then. Number 44, Think about Shingle Mountain in Dallas. In 1991, the Environmental Protection Agency issued a report confirming that a disproportionate number of toxic waste facilities were found in African American communities nationwide. No local government has ever affirmed and established a toxic waste facility in Highland Park, but they have in the residential areas of South Dallas. So that's pretty disgusting. Okay, I don't have time to read the rest of these. Let's look at the very last one on page 7. What's important is that until we arouse in Americans an understanding of how we created a system of unconstitutional, state-sponsored, de jure segregation, and a sense of outrage about it, neither remedies nor reparations will be on the public agenda. Turn to page 8. I'll move quickly through this. On the left, the color of law is concerned with consistent government policy that was employed in the mid-20th century to enforce residential racial segregation. On the right, why Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. In the book, maybe start with segregation and slums and separation and a long-term lack of police protection for African Americans. The reporting made me wonder how the St. Louis metropolitan area became so segregated. It turns out that economic zoning with a barely disguised racial overlay played an important role. Start here. There weren't enough houses, period. There were not enough houses. You remember they built the suburbs rapidly. The baby boom demanded more housing. And private home ownership was significantly championed to combat the idea of communism. But then it led to segregation. What kind of segregation? We said, the people said, well, it was de facto. It was a result from private practices. People wanted to live near people like them. But actually, it is almost all de jure segregation. Segregation by intentional government action is not de facto. It is what courts call de jure segregation by law and public policy. When there were and are no housing options, slums and ghettos boom, too many people crowded into too few square feet, subdividing the square feet. Now, this is a list of all that made it happen. A conspiracy of exclusion. Zoning laws, lending laws, loans would not be insured for African American buyers, not even for veterans. And don't forget the no down payment home buying loans for white veterans. Lenders and regulators, withholding of public services like water and sewer, utter lack of police protection. An African American family would move into a home in a white neighborhood. Crowds would gather, throw bricks through the windows, burn crosses on the lawn, burn some of the houses down. The police would do nothing at times. They would stand by and watch and laugh. There is no doubt about this historically. Page 9. In fact, many police officers in the South were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Mississippi, Alabama, this was true. Perpetual threat of collapsing property values, overt exclusion, physical walls were built separating white areas from black areas. There were sundown laws. If you are black in this community after sundown, we will not protect you. Deed restrictions where you could not sell property to an African American or a Jewish person. Toxic neighborhoods, Shingle Mountain, Flint, Michigan. Churches were segregated and racist. Read about W.A. Criswell at First Baptist of Dallas, how racist he was. He later apologized for it. The intentional use of highway placement for segregation enhancement. Freeways literally took away opportunities. Obviously, the intentional use of school placement. And don't forget the power of the mortgage deduction in building wealth that helped white families advance and kept black families out. And school textbooks absolutely ignored white supremacy in the Confederacy. Drop down a couple. More than a little outright ugliness. In Rosewood Courts, Austin's East Side Project for African Americans was built on land obtained by condemning Emancipation Park, the site of an annual festival to commemorate the abolition of slavery. What ugliness. Near the bottom, realtors were complicit. It was unethical to sell to African Americans. This is taken out of a realtor instruction. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental. Now, there were a few bright spots. Thurgood Marshall, Lyndon Johnson, Harold Ickes. What was going on here? White people did not want black people to have housing of inequality. White people sure did not want black people to have housing anywhere near white people. And white people used every means possible, from laws to lack of police protection, to perpetuate this otherness in and with living conditions. On the back, the last page, we need scattered site, not high rise, with true integration. And there's an instruction here about what to do if you have a house with a deed restriction. At the bottom, I'll give you my 5 lessons and takeaways. The default preference among white people is segregation. We are going to have to work hard against the default. You may object, Randy, not all white people, but historically, white neighborhoods stayed white. Number 2, the strategy is to maintain segregation through every means possible. We are going to have to say, no, this leads to unlawful segregation. Number 3, let's just admit the obvious. The underlying motivation is outright racism. Call it what it is and call it out for what it is. Number 4, who we elect and who serves on the courts really matters about this. And number 5, maybe we need to pay more attention to the motivation of greed. This book, The Color of Law, describes why black people were kept separate and why they did not have equal opportunity to advancement, and therefore we are paying the price at the end of the day. Hope you found this useful. I'm going to make a couple of announcements. We'll end by 8:40. I'm sorry, I'm a couple of minutes over, and then we'll open it up for conversation. Let me make just a few announcements quickly, and then I'll open the microphones. So hold on. We give stuff away. When we go back to normal life, we'll have certificates to attend the First Friday Book Synopsis, and we'll give the books away. I want to encourage you to attend additional events. Success North Dallas meets every third Wednesday at 7 a.m. And this month, they're going to bring in Scott Murray with a possible surprise guest that you would like to see, with sports ? So sports questions, I think. This is going to be live at the Prestonwood Country Club, 7 to 9 a.m., September 16th. And that is also going to be broadcast virtually. So you can choose either one. And Bill Wallace will be on the conversation afterwards, and you can ask him about this program. On the third Thursday of each month, I present books on social justice, one book a month, every month. And this month, this has never happened, and it's all due to planning. I'm doing the same book that I'm doing at the October First Friday book synopsis, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, whopping bestseller. If you want on the email list, go to 15minutebusinessbooks.com. Reminder, the cost of this remote meeting is free, but if you would like to contribute, you can do it through PayPal. I think that Letitia is going to put the link up on the chat, and you can do it through Zelle at randymayeux@sbcglobal.net. I am available to present these books on racial issues within companies and organizations, and I also can do it with any of the books on business items. You can purchase Synopsis with the audio plus the handout from 15minutebusinessbooks.com, and during these Zoom months, I am putting the recording of these Zoom sessions onto YouTube. Go to my blog for the links for that. Next month, the business book catapulted to the New York Times bestsellers list immediately. Trey Gowdy, a former congressman, Republican, Doesn't Hurt to Ask, Using the Power of Questions to Communicate, Connect, and Persuade. I've already skimmed the book. It's really good. It's going to be valuable on communication and really on paying attention. And then How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi for the fourth book that I share on racial issues. I think that's everything. Thank you so much for coming. I'm unmuting all of the microphones, and we are now open for conversation. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, you, Randy.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you very much.
Randy.
Well done.
Bill, do you want to say anything else about your meeting in September?
Yeah, it should be a fun meeting. It's our first one back. Scott Murray and sports ? And we think we're going to have a special guest there. But it's just taking a look at sports as we've gone through all of this, what to expect, what might or might not happen, and the lingering effects of it. A lot of positivity there. Of course, there's some negativity, but Scott Murray is eloquent, one of the best speakers around, and it's a good way to come back in person. And I would encourage each of you all, any of you all that haven't attended a meeting, please come as our guest. Go to successnorthdallas.com and sign up for our emails, successnorthdallas.com, to stay in the know. And we welcome you to come take a test drive. It should be a lot of fun.
Thanks, Bill.
We've had great response, Randy. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm glad you're giving the remote option for those who are not yet comfortable with gathering in person, because there will be some who are not yet ready for that. So
agreed.
Okay, who wants to start with a question or comment? Anybody? Make sure that you are personally unmuted. We'll take comments or questions on either Humanocracy or The Color of Law. Somebody get us started.
Randy,
I'll get it started. Go ahead.
There was
All right,
somebody-
Lynn O'Neill, go.
Okay, and just as a comment, and I put this in the chat too, but in the Humanocracy, they talk about most people still work in big organizations. That actually is not true. And well, it depends on how you measure them. But the federal government says small businesses are 500 employees or less, and that is right at 99%, excuse me, of all employees in the U.S. So it's real interesting.
Here's what he says about that. You are right, and all I can do is tell you what the book says. And so maybe, but what the book says is that if you take the total number of people who work in large organizations, that percentage has actually gone up. Now, the new businesses are smaller, and there are more smaller businesses, but the total number of employees is actually higher in big organizations. That's what the book says. I don't know that he's right, but that's the meaning behind that. So.
Well, I'll go back and check it, but I know that I've used that figure from the census an awful lot.
Okay.
And 64% of all U.S. businesses have 20 or less.
Yeah,
So
but
that may be where those big ones like the international ones. So I see what you're saying. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, it's the total number of people working is what it is. So that's what that is. Let me just comment that Solomon Israel is at the State Fair of Texas with big text behind him. He's muted, but I'm impressed. And so welcome to First Friday Book Synopsis.
Well, howdy, Randy.
Howdy, there we go. Okay. Who else has a comment or question?
Randy, may I say something?
Who
It's
is
Carol
it?
Francois here.
Hi, Carol.
Hi, Randy. Thank you for that great, both books. I'm very interested in both of those, but particularly The Color of Law. Our group is examining that same book, and I put up our podcast, so hopefully you all will jump in on that. We also have a podcast that covers education, systemic racism in education. But one thing I want to also say to piggyback on the discussion about The Color of Law, we're seeing as a result of the blight, of the racial segregation of neighborhoods, no trees. A lot of times those neighborhoods have no trees. And a result, what we're seeing is the environmental warming of the environment. So there's actually an unintended consequence that is going along with this intentional segregation that is harming everyone, all neighborhoods. So what was intended to shun and put minorities into ghettos and slums, it's coming around and it's having an effect on everyone because those no trees creates that heat. And in turn, no matter where you live, you're going to be affected by that environmental outcome. So I just wanted to throw that out there to make sure people understand that what goes around kind of comes around.
Okay.
But again, thank
Juan,
you. Great session.
Juan, you'll be next, but let me comment on Carol quickly. Carol, if you'll put into the chat the link to your podcast, that will be helpful. So
yes, I did, and I
good,
put
thank
it's
you.
on. It's all platforms right now, and so yes, please,
Okay.
I'll put it.
And I want to comment that I wish I had time. I took too long with Humanocracy, but The Color of Law also mentioned not only the segregation, but fewer parks for African Americans, fewer amenities that make life what it is. Juan, you were next. Juan, I don't know how to say your last name.
Thank you, Randy. Both books were excellent, but I have to say I got chills from The Color of Law as a white Cuban-born individual who grew up in this country and has a Jewish and a black side to his family. I've heard stories, personal stories, about what the book is about. And the sad part is that many Americans have no clue about this, absolutely no clue. So thank you for sharing that with us. Much appreciated.
I feel like these 4 books together, Stamped from the Beginning, White Fragility, The Color of Law, and How to Be an Anti-Racist, will at least give us the possibility of understanding the case to be made. And it can still be rejected. And there are authors who really say that everything should be personal responsibility, and that happened long ago. But The Color of Law really makes it hard to argue that the lingering effects are not real. It's a very well-resourced argument. So who's next? Somebody else needs to be next.
Hi, I'd like to say something. It's also got chills from this book. It's not that I haven't been aware that some of this stuff was going on. I grew up in New Jersey at the height of the race riots in the 60s, late 60s, and certainly. And what's startling is that how long ago was that, and to think that how much is still going on is just more than amazing to me to think about. And the first thing that comes to mind is where do we go from here? How do I help? What do I do? You feel a little bit helpless in some ways, but you can't help but think about, where am I going to make my impact? How can I change any thoughts of how I practice my business, how I advise and consult with companies, and right. And so it was such food for thought. And somebody mentioned about the combination of the book, the first book on humanocracy. That pertains to every employee.
That's right. That's right.
That pertains to every employee. So impactful. Thank you, Randy.
Well, and thank you. And let me say that when you ask, how do we tackle this? I'm going to use a phrase. I think we have been willfully blind or unintentionally uninformed or intentionally uninformed. I'm now reading so many books on this. I presented, let me just show this to you real quick. I presented a book for Urban Engagement Book Club called White Rage, the Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. And I presented that this month, or last month in August. And it tells the story of a medical doctor in Detroit, 1920, give or take, who moved into an all-white neighborhood. He had money. He had made enough money. And literally, they threw rocks, they attacked. He had a gun and ended up killing somebody who was attacking. Long story short, he was put on trial for murder when they were coming in to murder him. There's no doubt about that. Ultimately, he and his family all died, he by taking his own life. And the story of that book is white people did not want Black people at their work, in their neighborhoods, in their schools, period. And it created white rage. I think that as much as every training effort is helpful, there's a lot of training on something called implicit bias. I think we need to know the history better. That's my bias. So who's next?
Randy, John Rademacher here.
John, how are you?
Yeah, I would just like to say, I also was very impressed with The Color of Law. And I would think the timing of your presentations on these books is very, well, very timely, considering the circumstances and the times that we're going through right now. And I think, I mean, I've been sensitive too, but had no idea how institutionalized racism was until you went over this book. But I think the death of George Floyd has made a significant difference in this country, because you look at the crowds of people that are protesting, it's very diverse. And I think a lot of people have admitted, I had no idea what people are going through. Yeah. And I think we're ready in many ways that after this election, I hope it turns out the way I hope it does, that we're going to see a big change, and we've got a heck of a lot to do in this country. But if we can get everybody on board and understand what the Blacks have gone through, and minorities for that matter, and I think Reverend Bill Barber, if you've ever heard of him, has done some great work and talks about poverty. We've got to make some changes in this country if we want to continue with a true democracy and pursue the values that we have espoused for this country.
Let me first of all, John, thank you. Thank you. I'm very reluctant to get into politics in this discussion, but it is true that race issues are handled differently by different politicians. And I believe something does have to change. And so I'll let that out. If you want to know my politics, I can tell you where I write about it a lot, but I don't want to do that here. But I do think you're right that the death of George Floyd and some other incidents are raising the visibility of the reality. And I think that needs to happen. And I think we need to take advantage of this moment and learn our history better. So, and our current reality. So, you know, I really strongly encourage you to Google Shingle Mountain in Dallas and read about that story. It is unbelievable. And I promise you that many of us in our neighborhoods would not have tolerated. We would have we would have gone with pitchforks to City Hall to get this done. So who's next? Somebody else.
I'd like to speak to Sandra for just a second.
Hi, Tosh.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Well, Sandra, you'd mentioned how you feel like you can contribute. I think for each of us, it is really kind of uncovering things that are uncomfortable for all of us, because I've talked to my friend Taylor quite a bit that when you're not exposed to certain things, it's very difficult to kind of understand. So for me, it's just kind of introducing yourself to each individual person, because it starts at an individual level, I think so, and kind of unwrapping that package first, and then it kind of spreads out. So exposure, and I think for me, as I look at like teens who are growing up in lower income neighborhoods, if they're not exposed to something that's bigger, better, brighter, it's very difficult to see outside of that system. So my own personal calling, it's more of an individual thing to kind of reach back to the younger generation to say, hey, listen, there's more than just hanging out on the street corner and having your pants halfway down. That's just not okay in the world that I grew up in. And so sometimes it's difficult for other people to hear inside of our culture, but it's real life. It's real life. So kind of introducing one to another individual and understanding that and kind of unpacking that and then going out to the broader, for me, that seemed to be my purpose, because a lot of what's happening today, I've never been exposed to either. Even as a Black person, this is all so very new to me. And it's difficult to watch, and it's got to be difficult for a lot of my white counterparts. As uncomfortable it is for you, it's uncomfortable for us as well, because we're just like, hey, what happened? You know? And so our worlds have all been shaken as well. So I appreciate your willingness. And this whole conversation has just been great and very eye-opening for all of us. And so the best way is just to ask questions. And no question's a dumb question. Just ask the question.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that.
Thank you, Tosh.
You know, I did. I grew up in South Jersey, and my school was mostly African American. And when I was in 10th grade, I was moved to Kansas City, Overland Park, Johnson County, where there were none. And I was like, where the hell am I?
Yeah.
What happened? You know, I couldn't relate. I couldn't wait to get out of that school.
Yeah. Sandra, it's, by the way, the neighborhood with deed restrictions that became the model for the rest of the country was a neighborhood in Kansas City. So that's kind of interesting. I want to make, Solomon, you're next, but I want to make a comment first. The host of First Friday Book Synopsis is unhappy with the speaker at First Friday Book Synopsis for how long he spoke, just so you'll know. I'm unhappy with myself. And so I failed to say thanks to all of you who have contributed financially. This has been helpful to me, and I appreciate it very much. I also want to say, and this is the third month that we've had this happen. We had 83 people still discussing, you know, at 8:57 when Tosh started, and we've got 78 right now. I'm going to Zoom events where when it's over, people leave. We have an interest in this discussion of race, and this is important for us to have, and I hope you'll spread the word for next month for the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Okay, Solomon, you were next, so take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. And again, thank you again for the work that you do here, bringing these forward. This is kind of a trite question, but it is in the book, The Color of Law, or in your handout, you spoke about my home, to be very specific, does have those covenants that are illegal with respect to that. And I remember when we bought the home, the realtor said, as those covenants are in there, they're illegal, therefore they are no longer enforceable. But I've never thought there was anything I could do about them. And I wasn't clear. In your handout, it says, you know, here's a statement to be made. Is that an addendum to the covenant on the house, or is that only when you move, or how does that?
They are recommending, or he is recommending that you add this to your deed as an addendum. And let me read it because it's worth reading. It's on page 10 of the handout on The Color of Law. We, your name, the owners of the property at your address acknowledge that this deed includes an unenforceable, unlawful, and morally repugnant clause excluding African Americans from this neighborhood. Let me add that some of the deed restrictions also exclude Jewish people. So you could add the phrase Jewish people. We repudiate this clause, are ashamed for our country that many once considered it acceptable, and state that we welcome with enthusiasm and without reservation neighbors of all races and ethnicities. And so apparently what he says is it is easier to add this addendum legally than it is to try to take out the item that is in there already. So this is a well-worded addendum. And yes, Solomon, that's his recommendation. That's his
So you do that when you sell, or can you do that right now?
I don't, that one I do not remember
Okay.
from the book. So,
Correct.
and my guess is that my house in Richardson does not have a deed restriction, but I have not examined the deed. You know, I'll admit, I'll confess that. But I do know that in Highland Park, that neighborhood was planned to include, and they had those deed restrictions modeled after that neighborhood in Kansas City that became the model for the country. So pretty amazing. Who's next? Somebody else next.
Hey, Randy, it's
all right.
Taylor. Just say something briefly to the deed restrictions. First off, and thank you so much for these discussions. I've invited guests to come, and we want to continue this dialogue. So I worked in property management while I was in college at SMU, incidentally. And I got a chance to look at the deed restrictions in detail because it's part of my homework for my job. And so many neighborhoods, and people just gloss over it. When you close on your house, you get this big, and in the old days, you pretty much got a printout of them, and you didn't want to go through them. But you really need to look at what you're signing. And so I worked for a property management firm that they wouldn't take on the business if it had those types of racially explicit deed restrictions that would exclude races and exclude people based on the color of their skin or religious beliefs. And so if you're paying, Solomon, if you're paying HOA dues, go back to your HOA and ask them to help you with that. You shouldn't be paying HOA dues to live in your community and have your property management firm continue to perpetuate that.
Taylor, thank you. That's helpful information. And I'm assuming you saw some of this kind of deed restriction in your research.
I did, unfortunately, and I tell you, I turned a blind eye to it. I'll just admit that because I'm like, well, wait a minute. I technically grew up in Highland Park from the minute I was 17 when I moved to SMU and lived on campus, and then had rent houses and was there. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, I'm here. They welcome me, but not realizing that there was a systemic policy that would exclude people from owning homes in neighborhoods based on race.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to be much more aware, as Tasha said, and I've had conversations, and it's interesting the correlation between humanocracy, all the bureaucracy that we live through, as well as the color of law.
That's right.
And really taking that personal responsibility at an organizational level or at the communities that we live and work in. Because one of my friends, for example, told me that when she needs to return an item to a store, she makes certain that she has the receipt, she has the original bag, that she has every single tag. She and her girlfriend went into a store. They both had something to return. White female took it in a bag that was just a Kroger bag. It wasn't from, the item wasn't from Kroger. Returned the item from Kroger. My friend had it in the exact bag, everything, and the salesman did not want to accept her item back, accusing her of having stolen the item.
Yeah.
So I say that because somewhere in that store or that individual who is responsible for accepting returns made the decision that I'm going to discount the opinion of this person and accept the return from this person.
Based solely on the color of the person. That
Yeah.
is racism by definition. By definition. Bill Wallace was next, but let me make a quick comment. If you do not know the story, in the 1950s, a woman moved to Dallas. She had a degree from a college and a professional job. She was a black woman. She went into Neiman Marcus to buy a hat back when women wore hats. She was trying it on, and as she was near putting it to her head, a person grabbed her by the wrist and took the hat away and said, "You cannot try that on." And white women were trying them on, but black women were not allowed to. And that black woman was Eddie Bernice Johnson, who became Congresswoman. So that's the story. Bill Wallace was next. Bill?
Being a native Dallasite and growing up in the Park Cities, what you just said, there was a point in time Neiman Marcus did not allow blacks in the store.
That's right.
In their flagship store downtown. And, you know, the only comment I have is our silence has been agreement for so many, many years. We've agreed by our silence. We've agreed by not stepping up and saying something. And to the point of all the people here, it's time for the silence to end. We have to step up. There's so many of us that haven't. I've learned in the last 3 weeks so much that I didn't know, especially today. That some of the things in that book made the hairs on my arm stand up. I did not know. And I also just did a quick run through, text to a property management company, and they said most of the gated communities in Dallas still have something in the deed restrictions to this point, even those built in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So another point to look at. Thank you so much, Randy.
Bill.
This was tough to take on, and I'm so glad you did it.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. One more quick point, actually. So most of you know I'm a TV host and producer. Well, we are doing a series. It's actually for my podcast. It's called Intentional Talk. But we're starting a series on race. And one will be with a sheriff from Fort Worth who is white, but incidentally, he's adopted several black children. And he's going to be talking about being in law enforcement and how he has had to rethink how he works and the things that he's been taught to do right in Fort Worth, Texas. We're also bringing in a professor, Randy. I think you should be part of this discussion. And then I have someone who is responsible for organizational change and the unconscious biases that we see, and he's helping to train organizations on how to break through this horrible cycle that so many organizations have continued to follow along with. And so I'll share more details about that, but Randy, we'd love to have you part of that conversation.
Taylor, thank you, and I'd be glad to do that. I appreciate the opportunity. I want to comment on, thank you, Taylor. I want to comment on something Bill said. I said a while ago that I'm careful about getting into politics, but I'm going to make a comment that you might perceive as political. I think it is accurate that there are very few police officers who are bad apples. I believe that it's accurate that most police officers are good apples. But I think it is true that many of those good apples knew about the actions of some of the bad apples and were silent about it. And I think that is bad. And as long as police officers see bad activities and do not speak up, that is a silence that is costly. That's Randy Mayeux's opinion, and I may be wrong about it, but that's my opinion. So, who's next?
Jean, I wanted to speak on a couple of things. First, I wanted to talk about what Bill had just stated. I agree with what you're saying. I, in my heart, as an African-American woman, I feel as if there are more non-racist white people than there are racist white people. However, I do believe that the bulk of white people do not speak up and they do remain silent, which for the ones that are racist, gives the appearance as if they are complicit. And I understand that standing up to your peers of color puts you, just basically can create strife. And when it comes to employment, when it comes to business opportunities, but I think that as a whole, it would be ideal if you could look at the greater good of the country and the greater good of the generations and the people in this country. So I just I would say utilizing your white privilege to basically speak up and speak out against people that are racist. The other thing I wanted to mention was I have an aunt who just recently passed away. She was in her 90s, and she was a school teacher in Arlington, Virginia. And most parts of Arlington, Virginia, if anyone is not aware, is rather affluent. And as a school teacher, she wanted to buy a house. And a lot of the deed restrictions prevented her from buying in neighborhoods that she would be able to retain and increase the value of the money that she had spent. And she had to actually get her principal of the school, who was white, to sign a letter basically stating that she was a good and an ideal Negro and would not wreak havoc in this community. And because she did not allow deed restrictions to prevent her from buying in an affluent neighborhood where she had the money and she could afford it, her house alone, I was talking to my cousin, her granddaughter, the land alone, just the land alone is worth $750,000, just the land. So with her house on it is well over millions of dollars. So when you look at the decision and the fight that she took on, how that has been able to now create generational wealth for her offsprings, it's just to me it's mind blowing. But I just wanted to share that experience. Also, another thing too, my great grandfather was he was a doctor, and he had his own practice in Bristol, Tennessee, where he passed away. But prior to that, he traveled throughout the United States. And in history, I read, because I do a lot of genealogical research. In history, I read that and I did not know this was something that he never shared with the family, because none of the elders told me this. I actually read it in a book. He actually was in Arkansas, and he had set up practice for the African American community in Arkansas, and they called him in the book the Night Riders chased him out. Yeah. So it's opportunities like this where Black people who are able to become successful, and then they try to give back to their communities where it has been where white racist people have chased them out, or in order to keep the local Black people continuously at a disadvantage.
Yeah. Jean, thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
Randy.
Let me interrupt 1 second. I forgot to do something, and I'm going to do it now.